The camera was already rolling. The lights were too bright, pressing down on the stage, turning faces flat and unforgiving. The set was quiet, but not the kind of quiet that waits for a punchline. This was the silence that arrives just before something breaks. John Wayne stepped forward and stopped. Not for effect. Not for timing. His body hesitated before his mind could cover for it. For a second, no one knew what they were seeing. Some thought it was part of the bit. Others assumed fatigue. After all, legends weren't supposed to falter. Dean Martin didn't laugh. He was the only one who didn't. He saw it immediately, the look that had nothing to do with comedy and everything to do with danger. The look cameras were never meant to catch. Seconds later, John Wayne went down. The cameras stayed on. The lights didn't dim. No one yelled, "Cut." And what Dean Martin did next, quiet, unscripted, and completely against the rules of live television, changed how powerful people in Hollywood saw him forever. This isn't a story about a collapse. It's a story about what happens when the show doesn't stop, and one man refuses to let the moment become entertainment. Let us know where you're watching from, and we hope you enjoy the story. The studio lights were already hot before the cameras went live. Not warm, hot in the way only early 1970s television lighting could be, a dry heat that settled on the skin and stayed there. Thick cables lay coiled across the floor like black ropes, taped down hastily, humming faintly. Above them, rows of lights burned without mercy, bleaching color out of faces and leaving only outlines and smiles. The audience was in place, close enough to feel real, far enough to be controlled. They had come to laugh. They always did. Dean Martin stood where he always stood, loose posture, jacket open, glass in hand that might or might not contain anything stronger than water. His timing was perfect, as usual. He let the laugh crest before speaking again, rode it the way he had for decades. From the outside, nothing had changed. Same relaxed grin. Same easy rhythm. Same man America trusted not to take anything too seriously. John Wayne sat a few feet away, larger than the furniture, broader than the frame was meant to hold. Even seated, he dominated the space. The audience saw what they expected to see, solidity, weight, a man who had never been knocked off balance by anything life could throw. Few of them remembered the surgery years earlier, fewer still understood what it took out of him. On camera, history was optional. The exchange was light. A line landed. Applause rolled forward. Wayne leaned in to respond, and didn't finish the movement. It wasn't dramatic. No clutching, no sound. Just a subtle hesitation, like a sentence that never found its last word. His hand reached for the armrest and missed by inches. For half a second, it looked rehearsed. Improvisation, maybe. The kind of bit Dean himself might try. The director didn't cut. From the control room, it read as comedy. Two legends, a pause, tension before a punchline. No one wanted to be the first to break the illusion. Dean saw it immediately. Not the stumble, the eyes. The brief, unguarded flicker that had nothing to do with timing and everything to do with gravity. He had seen that look before, years ago, in places without cameras and without applause. He didn't smile wider. He didn't speak louder. He moved. The script dissolved in that step. Dean crossed the space between them, not hurried, not slow, placing himself just slightly forward, his back angled to the nearest camera. To the audience, it looked like a friendly interruption. To the lens, it became a problem, no clear shot, no clean close-up. Wayne's weight shifted again. Dean's hand was already there, firm on his forearm, not pulling, not pushing. Holding. He leaned in close enough that no microphone could catch the words. The director waved, irritated now, signaling for Dean to clear the frame. Dean didn't look up. He adjusted his stance instead, blocking more of the camera with his shoulder, turning the moment into dead space television hated. Laughter faded. The audience sensed it before they understood it. Something was wrong, and no one was telling them what. Dean felt the heat of the lights on the back of his neck and ignored it. Whatever this was, it wasn't for the room. It wasn't for the broadcast. And for the first time that night, the cameras were no longer in control. The red light stayed on. But the tone was gone. The applause never fully returned after the cut. It thinned out, confused, breaking apart as studio assistants moved too quickly and spoke too softly. Someone finally called it, voices overlapping, a hand slicing the air, and the lights dimmed just enough to change the temperature of the room. What had been performance turned into logistics. John Wayne was already on his feet when the cameras stopped, stubborn as ever, jaw set, insisting on balance he didn't have. Two hands reached for him at once. He waved one away. Dean Martin didn't let go. They moved him through a narrow corridor behind the set, past flats still painted with cheerful colors that suddenly looked artificial, almost mocking. The smell changed, less hot dust, more disinfectant and stale coffee. A makeup mirror somewhere buzzed under fluorescent light. By the time they reached the dressing room, the story had already started forming without them. Exhaustion, someone said, not asking permission. Heat, another added. No hospital, a producer insisted quietly, eyes already calculating headlines. Dean closed the door with his foot and reached for the phone before anyone else could touch it. No assistant. No secretary. He dialed from memory, numbers learned years earlier and never written down. The line rang longer than he liked. Wayne sat heavily, breathing measured but wrong, too shallow, too controlled. He tried to joke. Dean didn't answer it. When the voice on the other end finally came on, Dean turned his back to the room. He spoke low, direct, using a name no one else there recognized. The request wasn't framed as a favor. It was instruction born of familiarity. No, Dean said once, sharply, when someone suggested the nearest emergency room. Not there. You know why. The argument died quickly. There was something in his tone, calm, precise, that left little room for negotiation. He gave an address, not a destination. A car, not an ambulance. Quiet. Only then did it become clear to those watching that this wasn't improvisation or panic. Dean had a plan, and it hadn't started tonight. Outside, the press began to gather, tipped off by movement and silence. Inside, a publicist rehearsed a statement Dean hadn't heard and wouldn't repeat. He stepped into the hallway and shut that conversation down with a look. No raised voice. Just refusal. Someone asked how he knew which doctor to call. Dean didn't answer. He checked his watch instead. Wayne finally looked up at him, something close to apology in his eyes. Dean shook his head once. This wasn't the moment for that. They took the service exit, slipping past lights meant to attract attention, not hide it. The car waited with its engine already running. As they pulled away, Dean watched the studio recede in the side mirror, bright, contained, eager to forget. The official version would air within the hour. It would be clean, reassuring, incomplete. Dean sat back, one hand still steadying his friend, and said nothing at all. The room smelled like antiseptic and old paper, the kind hospitals never managed to replace no matter how many coats of paint they added. The machines were quiet now, present but unobtrusive, reduced to steady indicators rather than alarms. John Wayne slept angled slightly toward the window, one hand resting on the blanket as if he'd simply paused mid-thought. Dean Martin sat nearby, hat on his knee, coat still buttoned. He hadn't removed it since arriving. The nurses had learned quickly not to suggest comfort. For 2 days, no reporters had been allowed past the desk. For 2 days, Dean had answered questions that were never asked, correcting assumptions before they formed. He spoke to doctors privately, listened longer than he talked, nodded once when something mattered. There was no performance in it. Just attention. On the third afternoon, Wayne woke and looked directly at him. "You didn't have to do all that," Wayne said, voice rough, unpolished. Dean shrugged, eyes on the window. "Didn't feel like watching bad decisions get made." Wayne smiled faintly. Then, after a pause that stretched longer than the silence required, he said, "You remember that thing with Republic Pictures?" Dean's expression didn't change, but the room did. It felt smaller, closer. The memory came back intact. Early 1960s. A contract dispute buried in paperwork and resentment. Studio executives convinced Dean Martin had become difficult, too independent, too willing to walk away. There were quiet threats about future roles, about doors closing without announcement. Dean never argued. He never pleaded. He simply waited. Then John Wayne stepped into a room he wasn't invited to enter. No shouting. No ultimatums. Just a conversation that ended with the studio understanding what losing Dean Martin would cost them. The project moved forward. The pressure vanished. No article ever mentioned it. No quote was attributed. Dean hadn't thanked him then. That wasn't how things worked between men like them. Gratitude, when spoken aloud, became leverage. Better to keep it unspoken. Better to remember. "I remember," Dean said now, finally. Wayne looked away, embarrassed by the acknowledgement. "Didn't think you would." Dean leaned forward slightly. "I don't forget things that keep me working." They sat with that. No music. No speeches. Just the low hum of equipment and a distant cart rolling down the hall. In Hollywood, rescues were rarely dramatic. They happened in offices without windows, in conversations no one recorded. The debt wasn't written down, but it existed all the same. Later, after Wayne drifted back to sleep, a doctor stopped Dean in the hallway and spoke carefully, choosing words meant to soften reality. Dean listened, hands in his pockets, face unreadable. When the doctor finished, Dean nodded once. "I figured," he said. That night, alone in the waiting area, Dean stared at a wall covered in framed donations and outdated plaques. He didn't call anyone. He didn't pace. He simply sat, the weight of time pressing in a way it hadn't before. What happened on that stage days earlier wasn't instinct. It was accounting. Some debts were repaid loudly. Others were settled the only way that mattered, when no one was watching. By the time spring settled over Los Angeles, the story had been polished smooth. Lightheadedness. Dehydration. A long week of rehearsals. The phrases circulated quietly, efficiently, passed from studio offices to columnists who didn't ask for more because more was rarely rewarded. The audience accepted it the way audiences always had, grateful to be reassured, ready to move on. Behind closed doors, the tone was different. Dean Martin was invited, not summoned, to a meeting that felt like neither. The office was tasteful in the way power preferred, neutral colors, low lighting, a desk kept deliberately clear. Two executives spoke, alternating concern with familiarity, as if they were doing him a favor by being careful. They slid a page across the desk. A short monologue. Gentle humor. A line about age catching up with everyone eventually, delivered with a smile that would disarm speculation and restore comfort. The offer came wrapped in kindness. "Just a quick appearance," one of them said. "People trust you." Dean didn't touch the paper. "I was there," he said. Not accusatory. Final. "I'm not going to lie about it." There was no argument. That wasn't how consequences were delivered anymore. The page was taken back. The meeting ended early. Hands were shaken. Nothing was said that could be quoted. Within weeks, the temperature changed. A show that had been, in development, stopped returning calls. A guest appearance evaporated without explanation. Conversations ended faster than they used to. No one banned him. No one had to. Hollywood had learned long ago that silence could do what confrontation never could. At home, Dean noticed the difference immediately. The phone rang less. Invitations thinned. He spent more evenings alone, the television on but unwatched, a glass resting untouched longer than usual. He didn't complain. He didn't explain himself to anyone. Publicly, he remained the same. Relaxed. Detached. The man who never seemed to care enough to be hurt. Privately, the choice cost him more than anyone realized. What bothered him wasn't the work. He had enough of that behind him. What lingered was the pressure to perform reassurance, to tell people what they wanted to hear so they could forget what they'd seen. He refused to give them that. At a private club one night, an acquaintance leaned in too close and said, half joking, "You could have cleared it all up with one smile." Dean took a sip, set the glass down carefully, and replied, "Clearing things up isn't the same as making them disappear." The conversation ended there. He never corrected the official version. Never challenged it, never endorsed it. He let it exist without his voice, an incomplete record floating on its own. To some, it looked like indifference. To others, stubbornness. In truth, it was restraint. There were things you protected by speaking, and things you protected by refusing to. Dean understood the difference, even if it meant standing slightly outside the warmth of approval. The silence suited everyone else just fine. It was only hard on him. Time stopped announcing itself after that. It didn't arrive with dates or headlines anymore, just with smaller signs that were harder to ignore. John Wayne's movements slowed first. Not enough for strangers to notice, but enough that rooms seemed larger around him. Chairs were chosen more carefully. Conversations paused while he gathered breath. The pauses grew longer, though no one commented on them aloud. Dean Martin noticed everything. By then, he had mostly slipped from public view himself. Fewer appearances. Fewer obligations. To the outside world, it looked like choice, maybe even retreat. In reality, his days had narrowed to a precise orbit: houses with curtains drawn in daylight, private hospital entrances, kitchens where coffee went cold while decisions were made quietly at the table. He showed up without announcement. No entourage. No explanation. Sometimes he stayed 10 minutes. Sometimes an hour. He never stayed long enough to exhaust Wayne, and never left without making sure someone competent remained behind. Doctors spoke in controlled tones, careful with language. Dean listened, absorbing the gaps between sentences. He asked questions no one else thought to ask, not about outcomes, but about limits. What could be done? What shouldn't be pushed? Where dignity ended and risk began. Wayne tried to wave him off more than once. "You don't have to keep playing traffic cop," he said, irritation masking fatigue. Dean answered evenly. "I'm not directing. I'm editing." The real tension came from outside. Proposals arrived disguised as tributes. A final televised appearance. A short speech. A ceremonial role that would reassure audiences and secure legacies in the same motion. Each offer came with urgency, with the unspoken promise that this was the last chance to shape the narrative. Dean shut them down one by one. The worst of it came late one evening, after a long consultation, when a producer insisted Wayne's presence at a major public event would be manageable. The word hung in the room like an insult. Dean didn't raise his voice. He didn't argue the medical details. He simply said, if he collapses in front of people, that's not a celebration. That's theft. The appearance was cancelled the next morning. The explanation pointed elsewhere. Dean's name surfaced briefly, attached to the decision, and stayed there. He accepted it without comment, understanding the cost. Wayne knew. He didn't say so directly. Gratitude between them had long since moved past language. Instead, he said one night, staring at nothing in particular, "You're not letting them turn this into a parade." Dean adjusted the blanket and replied, not on my watch. The truth was heavier than either of them admitted. Nothing left could change the ending. What could still be controlled was the way it unfolded. Dean wasn't trying to save a life anymore. He was protecting the space around it, quiet, intact, unexploited, until time finally made its move. By early 1979, the phone rang differently. Not louder. Not more often. Just later. Calls came after midnight, when voices dropped automatically and names were tested before being spoken. John Wayne's condition was no longer a subject, it was a perimeter. Everyone close to it knew where the edges were, even if no one said the word out loud. Dean Martin took those calls alone. He stood in kitchens with the lights off, one hand resting on the counter, listening without interruption. The questions circled the same point from different directions. How long? How bad? How soon? He never answered directly. He didn't have to. What surprised him wasn't the concern. It was the timing. A major publication, one that had ignored the incident for years, had decided the distance was now safe. Reporters began reconstructing the night on the studio floor piece by piece. Old technicians were contacted. Notes resurfaced. Someone had kept a partial recording. Someone else remembered where the camera angle broke. The shape of the story emerged slowly, inevitably, like an image developing in a darkroom. They wanted Dean. Not the comedian. Not the brand. The witness. The pitch was careful, respectful. An opportunity, they said, to finally tell the truth. To correct the record. To explain what really happened when the cameras didn't cut. Dean listened. Asked for time. He spent the next evening at Wayne's house, sitting farther from the bed than usual. Wayne's breathing had become uneven, punctuated by silences that made the room hold still. Between them, nothing was said about journalists or headlines. Later, alone, Dean wrote a few lines on a pad. Not jokes. Not statements. Plain sentences. Honest ones. The kind that would land because they didn't reach. He read them once. Then he tore the page in half and dropped it into the trash. The next call came the following night. Same offer. More urgency. Dean declined. This isn't about me anymore, he said. The person on the other end pushed back gently. Reputation. Legacy. History. Words that usually worked. Dean let the silence stretch until they stopped. There are things that are true, he said finally, and there are things that need protecting. Sometimes they're the same thing. He hung up without waiting for agreement. The cost was immediate. Whispers hardened. Assumptions returned. The old version of the story gained strength simply because the real one stayed quiet. Dean understood that this was the final trade, clarity for privacy. He chose privacy. That night, he drove with the radio off, the city empty around him. He wasn't thinking about headlines or vindication. He was thinking about timing, about knowing when to step forward, and when stepping back was the only honest move left. Not everything that's true deserves an audience. Some truths belong to the people still breathing. The news broke early, carried in measured tones that sounded practiced even when they were new. By mid-morning, flags were lowered, statements prepared, photographs selected, the familiar machinery of public farewell already in motion. John Wayne was gone. The service was arranged with precision. Names filled the guest list the way credits filled a screen. Politicians, actors, men who had shared frames with him and men who had shared nothing but reflected light. Words were assigned. Order established. Cameras positioned at a respectful distance that still caught everything. One absence was noted almost immediately. Dean Martin wasn't there. At first, people assumed delay. Then misunderstanding. By the time the speeches began, the explanation hardened into speculation. Old rumors resurfaced. Stories filled the space silence left behind. Some said distance. Some said regret. A few said indifference. No one asked him. Those who knew better watched the empty chair near the front, the one placed without a name, and said nothing. The ceremony unfolded exactly as expected. Praises spoken cleanly. Achievements catalogued. Strength emphasized. The version of John Wayne that belonged to history, not to late nights or hospital rooms, stood intact. Dean remained out of frame. Weeks later, after the flowers wilted and the calls slowed, a detail surfaced quietly, almost accidentally. No announcement. No acknowledgement. Just a correction made by someone who had handled arrangements and noticed a change they hadn't ordered. One element of the burial, small, easily overlooked, had been handled privately. Paid for in advance. Specified without flourish. Something Wayne had once mentioned offhand, years earlier, never thinking anyone would remember. There was no name attached to it. Only then did the picture shift. Dean hadn't stayed away because he didn't care. He stayed away because he did. He understood how easily grief could be redirected, how quickly presence became performance. One appearance, one microphone, and the story would have bent toward him without meaning to. He refused to let that happen. Those close enough eventually understood, he had been there all along, just never where anyone could point. Not on the stage. Not at the podium. Not inside the shot. The last thing he did for his friend wasn't visible until it was already finished, and even then, only if you knew what to look for. Years later, when the incident on that television set was mentioned again, someone asked why Dean Martin had never explained himself. The answer was simple, though never spoken. The camera had been rolling when John Wayne faltered. But the moments that mattered most happened after the lights went out.